Billy Bartram here, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about my travels this morning, starting in the colony of Pennsylvania in a village called Philadelphia, where my father John has a garden. I embarked on a sailboat from there down to a place called Charlestown in the South Carolina territory. From there, I went to a village called Savannah in the Georgia territory and worked my way south, eventually coming to a place that was known as Cowford because the river was narrow there and the cows would cross the river at this particular point. As I came across, I was with a young man that wanted to accompany me from Darien, Georgia, young Mr. McIntosh. When I got to Cowford, he saw the metropolis of the village and he decided not to join me on the rest of my journey down into the Florida Peninsula. No worry, I went on my own, but I did realize that it would be better to trade our horses for something that was maybe more efficient in this river, and that would be a sailboat. As I loaded all my gear into the sailboat and began going upstream, the winds were very favorable, and it was quite a delightful journey. But as I got close to the shoreline, I started seeing creatures that I had never seen before, animals that I had only seen in Chinese literature, dragon-like creatures. And this particular creature was trying to get into my boat. I had no choice but to dispatch this animal with a musket ball. I think it even took 2 shots. But as I learned, as I was skinning out this alligator, because when you're traveling as I am, anything could be a potential meal. And I realized that the tail of this creature had quite a bit of muscle and meat in it, because as I observed them swimming, they would swim back and forth like this with this giant tail. And as I come to study these dragons, I realize that they're quite fierce and they wrestle with each other. In fact, 2 days ago, I saw one with only one eye. Yesterday, I saw one with a hind leg chewed off. And then I realized these animals can live with one eye. They swim with their tail back and forth like this. They can live with 3 legs. But if they're wrestling and they bite another one on the back and break that backbone, that's it. Does anybody know the name of this animal? You can talk to your teacher about that. And I have never seen a creature like this before. You can see it's kind of like a turtle shell, but it's very dome-shaped, this particular turtle shell. And as I see these creatures in my travels, I started seeing them in the Georgia colony, about 100 miles north of here, on the sand hills. And you could see the dirt that was excavated out of the burrows that this creature digs is out in front of the burrow. Well, I had set up my camp very similar to what you see here, and I saw one of these creatures about 50 paces away off in the distance. And I saw the turtle come out. And I said, now's my chance. I could maybe determine what other creatures could live in this burrow. That's what I'd been told by the locals. So I see this turtle come out, and he's grazing off to the side. They're vegetarians, you know. He's grazing off to the side, and I look in the shadow of the burrow, and I see some movement, but I can't quite see what it is. I see some movement, so I start as quietly as possible, making my way towards the burrow, as quietly as possible. I get a little closer, and I still see the movement, and I see a little black nose in the shadow of the burrow, moving around. I know something's in there now. I get a little closer, about 5 paces away. I see a little black nose and whiskers around that nose. I get on my hands and knees at this point. I'm looking. I'm getting really close. And I get about 2 paces away from this burrow, and I see the nose and the whiskers and two black beady eyes. Just at that same moment, this creature comes charging out at me. I jumped back, he dove down in his burrow, and we got along fine the rest of the day. I ran back to my camp and he went down in the burrow. The point of this story is that this particular animal, it's called a gopher tortoise, and it lives in burrows in the ground. It excavates these burrows. The legs of this animal are shaped more like shovels rather than legs on a turtle for swimming. This animal doesn't swim at all. In fact, if you were to put this tortoise in water, it would drown. But it has shovel-like legs. And some of the other animals that live in this burrow includes that animal that I just saw, that I just described to you. And now you can talk it over with your teacher and try to figure out what that animal was. I know, and I will tell you shortly. But there's other turtles that I've been seeing along the way. This is quite an interesting one here. Let me move a little closer where you can see it. This is quite an interesting one here. You notice the color patterns on the shell. Beautiful shell. What's really interesting, this one has a hinge on the bottom. It looks like that, a hinge on the bottom. And it has a hard shell like this. Very similar to the gopher tortoise, this one has a dome-shaped shell. So that's a clue that this turtle probably lives on land. And if you're thinking that, you're exactly right. But what happens when a predator comes along, I hope everybody knows what a predator is. That's an animal that goes after another animal for food. That's a predator. So when a predator comes after this particular turtle, this is what he does. He pulls in his back legs, pulls in his front legs, pulls his head in, even pulls in his tail, closes the hinge on the shell, and he's completely protected from the predator. This is an amazing adaptation of this particular turtle. Think about the name of this one, and we'll talk about that later too. But a clue is the shape of the shell. Now, I've been encountering all kinds of plants and animals, as you can see. And this is quite an amazing pine tree. Everybody knows this is a pine cone. But look at the size of this one. This is a giant pine cone. This particular cone comes from a tree called a longleaf pine. And this longleaf pine tree is in a giant forest. This giant forest I've been seeing for hundreds, maybe even 1,000 miles. When I came through the area of the Virginia colony, down into the Carolinas and Georgia, and into the Florida territory, you can look at this on a map. Your teacher will help you. And then even going west to a place that will become known as Texas is this giant longleaf pine forest. And this is a pine cone from that forest. But the really interesting thing about this forest is there are huge animals living in this forest. There's one animal in particular that when everybody thinks of this animal, they think of it as an animal that is out in the western part of the United States or the new colonies of America. But we have this animal in this giant pine forest because on the floor, on the bottom of this giant pine forest, it's like a savanna. And a savanna is kind of like a pasture where there's grass growing, maybe 2 or 3 feet high, that's all underneath a very scattered canopy of these longleaf pine. This particular animal I'm talking about is called a woodland bison or buffalo. How many of you have seen a buffalo in your days? Think about that. Now, there's other large animals that roam this giant forest as well. One of them will become known as the Florida panther. And this is a very sizable, a very large cat, really, and they're amazing animals. They can jump over 30 feet high. That's probably higher than your classroom. maybe 2 classrooms. Now, there's another animal that I've encountered in my travels upstream from here in Palatka, and that's an animal where I set up my camp and I had a nice fire going, and I had caught some fish that day. And I made my usual stew and I filleted the fish. And as I was getting ready to go into repose, that's another name for go to sleep, I decided to hang up some of the meat of the fish on a line over my fire and where I was sleeping. Well, let me tell you what happened from here. I had stoked up my fire, everything was good. I was getting a little bit sleepy. It was time for repose. So I laid down on my skins and I closed my eyes and I was enjoying the silence of the night and the night sounds, the frogs, the crickets, the cicadas. Then suddenly I heard something rustling through the forest, stomping with its feet. More than one of these creatures. I got up and I looked around. I couldn't see anything. I stoked up my fire a little bit more and laid back down. I heard the noise again. This time when I woke up, the fish were gone from the line over my head, directly over my head. I come to find out this creature that had entered into my camp with his associates off in the woods waiting for him was a very large dog-like creature. And some of you may not know that we had these creatures historically around Palatka in the East Florida Territory. This animal is called a red wolf. How much easier would it have been for him to leap upon me and rip out my throat? But no, he decided to gently remove the fish on the line over my head and take them to his howling associates. Now, as I'm sailing in the Palatka, that's the Indian word for river of lakes. And by the way, just to review a little bit, the Indians had given me a name that means the flower hunter. Some of you may want to think about what the Indian name is for me that means flower hunter. As I'm traveling down the Palatka in my sailboat, I'm encountering these giant trees. And this is part of the giant tree that I've been encountering. You see the shape of it. It's kind of long and it's pointed up here. And I come to find out that these trees are known as cypress trees. And they are giant. They are enormous. And they grow quite tall. This is a small one here. They grow quite tall and quite large in diameter. And as I talk to the Indians along the way that I've been meeting, they've been telling me that this cypress tree is the preferred tree for their dugout canoes. You'll probably see a dugout canoe later because it's a soft wood and it's easy to float and they're so big in diameter that someone can row on this side and someone sitting next to him can row on this side. As I come to find out about these dugout canoes, they can be so large that the Indians take them out into the ocean. It's quite amazing. Would you take a canoe, a dugout canoe, out into the ocean? These Indians are very brave. Speaking of plants, this is another one that I've been seeing. Take a closer look at this. Look at the size of that. And let me just say, it is quite heavy and quite solid. I come to find out in talking to my Indian friends that I'm meeting along the way, things like this grow on pine trees. It will eventually become known as a gall. And you can see with the handle on it here, it makes a quite formidable weapon or a tool. And I come to find out that the Indians make different kinds of tools out of these and also weapons. And all I know is I wouldn't want to get hit in the head or any other part of my body with this thing. This is another interesting thing that I've been seeing in my travels. This is a wild grapevine. And you notice the holes along it. The holes along here. When a piece of wood dies, there's a first kind of a creature that comes in called a consumer. This particular creature that comes in is insects. Some of you may have heard of termites and creatures like that. These insects come in, and then think about what kind of other animal would eat an insect. And it's a bird, and it has a beak, and it goes like this. Think about that. Your teacher can probably give you some ideas on what that bird might be. But that's what made these holes in this particular wild grapevine. So I was in my sailboat about 5 miles south of here, and I saw along the shoreline giant oak trees. Giant oak trees with these wild grapevines growing in it. And this is a small one compared to the ones I've been seeing. The ones I saw were 12 and 13 inches in diameter, about this big, a wild grapevine. And as I went into this oak hammock, as I went in with the wild grapevine all overhead, it was dark and shady and protected in there. I wrote about it in my journal. I called this place an enchanted canopy. I stayed there 2 nights. The second night, it rained, and the rain would not penetrate this canopy. I was very protected, and I felt very safe there. That was my first encounter with giant wild grapevines. And then I went a little further upstream, and I noticed on the sides of the bank, and I think this may be where Palatka was initially formed, was another Indian village. And there were about 15 structures in a row, almost like a promenade or a street. And there were fields, a couple hundred acres of fields with all kinds of vegetables and produce in these fields that the Indians would eat. And in the water close to the shoreline as I was going by, there were young boys and girls, and they were playing in the water. The boys had spears and bows and arrows. I think they were after frogs and fish. The girls, they were a little more timid. They ran back up to the women at the village. But the boys, they waved to me as I went by. You will come to learn that this place I saw where the Indian village was will become known as the city of Palatka, where you are right now. And because it was formed there was because the river was so narrow there. That's what Palatka means, river crossing. Boys and girls, my name is Billy Bartram, and it's been a pleasure talking with you today.